In the last episode, the Japanese forces retreated from Gwak after the Koreans had launched a surprise mortar attack. Now we head south once again to the city of Jinju. I'm Stefan, and this is, of course, Japan at War. The city of Jinju was just west of the Japanese-held stronghold at Busan on Korea's southern coast. You see, ever since 1591, the Korean government had expanded the walls to accommodate even more of the local citizens, which meant that it would be even harder to defend now, as it required even more soldiers to protect them. And they only had around 3,800 men to defend it, but they also had a very competent commander named Kim Si-min, who had actually been appointed magistrate just 1 month ago. They also had around 70 matchlocks. Now these were some of the first Korean-made matchlocks, and a very much needed weapon if they were to survive the war. The Japanese forces arrived outside the walls of Jinju on November the 8th. The army numbered around 13,000 from the 7th contingent, under the combined command of Kato Mitsuyasu, Hasegawa Hidekazu, Nagaoka Tadaoki, and Kimura Shigeji. The commanders marched their men within firing range of the guns. Then, the Ashiguru leveled their matchlocks and then fired at the walls to try and scare the defenders. Now, unfortunately for the Japanese, this didn't work. The Korean commander, Kim Si-min, gave the orders to keep their heads down until the Japanese were on the walls. The volley was met with complete silence. I'm sure that the Japanese commanders were quite confused by a lack of response. And then, after the sun had fallen, they actually got one. Commander Kim sent a man up to the top of the fortress to play a flute. This was actually meant to show the Japanese that they were not afraid. With the commanders of the Japanese army understanding that they would now not be able to scare the Koreans into surrender, the command was given to prepare to assault the walls. They started by making a makeshift enclosure to hide what they were doing from the Koreans. They then made a 3-story high siege tower and made ladders from the surrounding pine and bamboo, large enough to reach the walls and to be able to actually hold 6 men per rung. While they were busy building their siege equipment, the Koreans were busy making their own preparations. They had their fletchers make extra arrows and had lead melted down for gunshot. They also made piles of stone at strategic intervals on the walls to throw at the attackers, as well as placing pots of boiling water. But that's not all they did. They gathered straw around packets of gunpowder to make improvised grenades, and put spikes through planks of wood to throw at the attackers. The battle began with the Japanese opening fire from on top of their siege tower. They did this with the plan to keep the Korean heads down while their men scaled the walls. Many of the Ashiguru rushed forward with their ladders, hoping to be the first one over the walls. But there were so many rushing onto the ladders that the ladders actually started to break. One of the men trying to scale the wall was the samurai commander Hosokawa Tsudeoki. A chronicler tells us about the climb. There he was, with Ashiguru to the left and right. He gave the order that until he personally had climbed onto a castle, that the ladder was just for him to use, and if anyone else tried to climb with him, he would cut off their head. Because of this, the ladder did not break, and he got up. The men who saw him shouted their praise loudly. But when he tried to make his way over into the castle, many spears and glaives were thrust at him to try and make him fall. Unfortunately, he did fall to the bottom of the moat. This did not stop the attack, as many Japanese soldiers rushed to the ladders to get over the walls. The commander Kim Si-min told his men to fire their arrows and matchlocks at the men climbing. The stones and large pieces of red-hot metal were also thrown at the attackers on the walls. Any man who wasn't killed or knocked off of the walls were met with boiling water or those spiked planks of wood. And if they did manage to get on top or even get close to the top of the walls, the Koreans used their spears and glaives to stab and slice at them. When the Japanese matchlock men tried to fire at the wall's defenders, Kim actually had his archers release huge volleys of arrows to keep the matchlock men from being able to get any good shots off. Then, when the ashigaru gathered up to reset any ladders that had fallen, the Koreans threw over their improvised grenades. At first, the straw simply burned and seemed harmless to the attackers, and then the fires reached the gunpowder and exploded, creating huge clouds of smoke, severe burns, and at times just killing men outright. The attack on Jinju's walls lasted for several days. Commander Kim Si-min was able to keep the men's morale pretty high and kept the coordinated defense going. Eventually, bands of civilian volunteers arrived to aid the defenders. One group that was too small to be able to be much help climbed on top of a nearby hill to beat their drums and lit a large amount of torches so that their enemy would think that they were being outflanked by a large Korean army. Then another group, led by the soon-to-be famous folk hero, Gwak Jae-u, also known as the Red Coat General, showed up with around 200 men. Gwak's forces ran up the slopes to the Japanese camps, yelling, "The Red Coat General is gathering soldiers from all over the south and will soon arrive with a massive army." And then the Japanese got word that a force of around 2,000 armed civilians were on the way to relieve the defenders. Now this actually forced the Japanese to divert a portion of their forces to block the incoming army from entering the city. The siege of Jinju lasted a staggering 5 days, just repeating the same thing over and over. The Japanese ladders would get knocked off, and the Korean righteous armies would skirmish with the Japanese in the open. On the early morning of November 13th, the Japanese lit as many torches as they could to show the Koreans that they were packing up their camp and preparing to leave. And then, the torches were suddenly extinguished and a massive charge was thrown against the wall. One group of ashigaru laid down a wall of suppressive matchlock fire, forcing the Koreans away from the walls, while another group made one last attempt to scale the walls. The Koreans at this time were actually close to breaking. The stocks of arrows were incredibly low, and there was no more stones to throw over the walls either. On top of that, most of the city was burnt, and their brave commander Kim Si-min was mortally wounded from a matchlock ball to the side of his head. And around 1,000 Korean defenders were actually dead at this time. Despite all of this though, Japanese commander Kato Mitsuyasu and his fellow commanders decided to halt the attack completely, and pulled out from the area. They did so under the cover of a massive rainstorm in the hopes to not be pursued. And this is where I will leave you, an incredible defense mounted by the Koreans. This battle is actually considered one of the most important battles of the entire war, as it was further proof of the Koreans' ability to defend their fortifications, and was a very badly needed boost in morale for any of the Koreans that actually heard about it. In the comments section, tell me what strategy you would have done to achieve victory. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. See you next time.